so many people have been touched by the fruit of her witness. And, so there are in some cases tangible results, as in there are people who she advocated for and they were released from prison, or she was part of the Regis movement that eventually won Japanese Americans reparations and an official apology, right? In some cases, there are tangible results. In other cases, the tangible results are maybe not the stuff that always makes it in the history books. It's the letters that she would stay up writing to people, right, to comfort them in prison. And she would send $5, $10, $20 to them just so they could buy something at the commissary, right, just to ease some of their suffering, right? Or she would visit people, right, who might be serving lifelong sentences. So this is an incredible witness.
Hello and welcome to Can I Get a Witness, the podcast. This podcast is an audio companion to the book, Can I Get a Witness? 13 Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators for Faith and Justice. I'm Shay Tuttle. In each episode of this podcast, I'll talk with one of our authors about the person they profiled for the book and about their writing process. Today, I'm speaking with Grace Y. Gao. Grace Y. Gao is professor of ethics and co-director of the Center for Sexuality, Gender, and Religion at Claremont School of Theology. She is the author of Grounding Human Rights in a Pluralist World, published by Georgetown University Press in 2011, and the co-editor of Asian American Christian Ethics, Voices, Methods, Issues, published by Baylor University Press in 2015, and Encountering the Sacred, Feminist Reflections on Women's Lives, published by T&T Clark in 2018. For our book, Grace wrote on Yuri Kochiyama. Well, Grace, thank you for talking with me about Yuri. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So thanks for doing it.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, great.
So for folks who may not be familiar with Yuri Kochiyama and her story, can you start off by just giving us a sort of summary of her significance, what she's known for, and why she's in this book?
Okay, so she is known for her civil rights and revolutionary work. So she has been celebrated by the White House for her advocacy for racial ethnic communities and her support for marginalized peoples around the world. She was someone who was incarcerated with other Japanese Americans during World War II and became an activist for Regis efforts. She's been involved in political prisoner movements. So basically, she's known as an activist and perhaps the best known activist of Asian American heritage. That's how people might know her. The other thing I should add is that some people don't know that part, but they know friend of Malcolm X because they've had obituaries about her and him, and she was famously at she was cradling his head as he lay dying after having been assassinated. So some people, know her visually as that Asian woman with those iconic glasses cradling his head.
So in just a minute, I'd like to ask you to read an excerpt from your chapter about this really defining experience of Yuri's life. But before we do that, could you talk a little bit about what her life looked like before the experience you're going to read about?
Okay. So she is second generation Japanese American, meaning she was not an immigrant, her parents were. And she describes her life prior to World War II as being, red, white, and blue existence and a so-called banana. Banana means you're yellow on the outside and you're white on the inside. So she will describe herself as an apple pie, baseball, like just one of those people who had a very romantic, but later on she would say colonized mentality, popular in school, et cetera, et cetera. And the experience of World War II and the mass incarceration really opened her eyes to unjust suffering, not just of her people, but of others.
Great. Okay, so if you could read that excerpt, that would get us into her story. That would be great. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Within hours of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, 3 agents from the FBI appeared at Yuri's home where she lived with her twin brother Peter, older brother Art, and Japanese immigrant parents in a white neighborhood in a coastal town near Los Angeles. The FBI said they were looking for her father, Seiichi, a fisherman and small business owner who sold fish and supplies to American and Japanese ships that sailed between Japan and the West Coast. Yuri told the agents he was sleeping, as he had just returned from the hospital a day earlier after having undergone an ulcer operation. The FBI nevertheless brusquely rifled through the family's belongings, demanded that Seiichi get dressed in a bathrobe and slippers, and quickly whisked him away to an undisclosed location without even giving her a chance to say goodbye. What the Nakaharas didn't know was that Seiichi was one of more than 700 Japanese-American fishermen, business leaders, farmers, produce distributors, Shinto and Buddhist priests, Japanese language school teachers, and consular officials who were being detained on fears of possible espionage, all within 24 hours of the attack. Though the specific reasons for Seiichi's arrest were not then disclosed, a lawyer friend found out several days later that he had been taken to a federal penitentiary on neighboring Terminal Island. When Yuri's mother, Suyako, saw his health decline over a short period of time during her visits, he was diabetic, had respiratory problems, and was still recovering from surgery. She sent desperate telegrams to anyone who might possibly be in a position to intervene, pleading with them to attend to his urgent medical needs before turning to the matter of his arrest. Perhaps due to her persistent efforts, Seiichi was eventually transferred to a hospital several weeks later, so he was placed in a room full of recovering U.S. merchant marines with a sheet around his bed and a sign that read, "Prisoner of War." Yuri and her brother Peter were finally permitted to visit their father on January 13, 1942, after he had been moved to a private room for his safety. Seiichi seemed to them very weak, emaciated, and disoriented. He cowered when he saw Peter, who, as a new enlistee, had come proudly dressed in his army uniform and said in Japanese, "You are not my son. You came to interrogate me." Seiichi recognized Yuri, but worriedly asked her, "Who beat you up?" even though there was nothing about her to suggest a recent assault. The family saw him again in an even worse state a week later when he arrived home from the hospital in an ambulance. Yuri recalled, "He couldn't talk. He made only guttural sounds, and we didn't know if he could hear. We put our hands over his eyes to see if he could see. There was no way even to know if he could see. All he did was to make guttural sounds until he passed. By the next morning, at age 54, he was dead."
Thank you. It's devastating just to sort of hear that story. So you write that it was a couple of months later when Yuri herself was also imprisoned.
That's right.
Can you talk a little bit about her experience of incarceration? It really comes through in your chapter that, of course, it's terrible because it's incarceration, and that there are some sort of surprises in that experience for her. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So in the excerpt I just read, I mentioned that she lived in a white working class town. And because she was this red, white, and blue American, she didn't actually hang out with a lot of Japanese Americans, right? But of course, the experience of incarceration puts her with only people of her kind. So what she writes about in her own journals and diaries is that absolutely she saw the worst. She saw people go mentally insane. You know, she saw her brother's asthma being aggravated because, you know, their detention sites were really converted horse stalls and, you know, really bare bones type of living situation. So she saw the worst, but she felt like she also saw the best. She saw women coming together to create bathroom privacy curtains, right? Or, partitions, right? So families could have a little bit more privacy. She saw people try to beautify their ugly, barren places by planting gardens. So she saw the best and the worst, and she said she fell in love with her people in the camp. And as I write later on in the chapter, I explain how she really started to organize in the camps. She initiated this letter writing campaign to the soldiers serving outside of the camp. And that really gave her the skills to organize and mobilize people to a common cause after she emerged from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's hopeful, even though it's all such a terrible situation, to see how some of those things were so formative for her and for who she went on to be. There's something really neat about that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So you mentioned that her father's arrest and his death, and then even her own incarceration, didn't sort of all by themselves make her into the activist that she would become. You say she had to be conscientized. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so she got this glimmer of suffering, right, and unjust suffering in the camps, right, because it was one of those things where they were just told there's a presidential executive order saying if you're a Japanese heritage person, even if you're a native-born citizen, you have to be contained, right? So clearly she had this inkling that something's not right. But the vast, if you read accounts of how the Japanese American community transitioned post-camp, there was just this, there were large-scale feelings of silence and shame, right? That it's best not to talk about the experience, or let's just try to put it behind. So I'm sure that's a factor of that. Mm-hmm. And then her conscientization also happened with her living in parts of the South and seeing how African Americans were poorly treated, right? And then later on, she moves to New York, and she is now living in government-subsidized apartments with a mostly Black and Puerto Rican neighbor base, right? And so she is living with them, experiencing life with them, and hearing more and more about their struggles. And so that all of these factors play into her sense that she had been seeing America, right, with these rose-colored glasses.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me wonder about how, those early experiences may have opened her eyes as she moved on through the rest of her life to some of that suffering. It makes me wonder without that how, I'm sure she still would have been affected by those other communities, but how much did that change the way she received it? I don't know. I guess there's not a way to know that, but it's interesting.
Sure, right. So it's clear that she's always been a people person, right? But because she directly experiences imprisonment, right, and the abuse of power, right, by governmental agencies, you can see how her own direct victimhood transferred into her compassion and concern for other people, right? Yeah. And of course, this is, because this is a volume on radical Christians, right? I talk about in the chapter how this was also part of her teaching, right? That she was this faithful Presbyterian churchgoer, teaching Sunday school, and she was always taught to be of service to people in need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's perfect because that's my next question.
Oh,
You're
look at
right.
that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. You're right that Yuri is often remembered for her, her long career as an activist, and for her cross-racial solidarity work, which I think is really fascinating. But I think in your chapter, you're kind of saying you want to point out a couple of things that often get left out. And the first one that you mentioned is the role of religion in her life. So could you talk a little
Yes.
bit more about sort of how that functioned for her, why that mattered to her, and why you think that's important in order to be able to understand her activism, why an understanding of her faith is important for understanding her activism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So one of the sources I draw upon is her biographer, Diane Fujino.
Mm-hmm.
She's written this book called Heartbeat of Struggle. And she ultimately offers a picture of Yuri's Christianity as a humanitarian one, right? That it was, and I think that's a fair characterization,
Mm-hmm.
meaning Yuri's Christianity was not of the make converts or teach Christian doctrine variety, right? She never had that view, even when she was trying to boost morale in the camp and leading Sunday school. So, for instance, that letter writing campaign started by her leading her junior high Sunday school girls, right, into an activity. Right? So that's point one, that the faith that she inherited and was raised in was always mission oriented, but again, not in that evangelical confess Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior kind of way, right? And so insofar as that she always had this gospel, people would call it sacramental view of God or so, then it's incorrect to think, as some people have said, that she lessened her Christian commitment the further along she grew in her political activism. So that's a common story, right? That Yuri was a faithful, church-attending, Sunday school teaching person, and then she became radicalized, right?
Yeah.
And then her religious commitments tapered off. That's a very common view, and I do understand how and why people hold it. But I say in my chapter, first of all, she never lost her commitment to the institutional church. So in fact, after her husband retired, she took several jobs, first at a Presbyterian church and then at a United Methodist church doing overseas relief work, right? So that's that thing. And then secondly, because her Christianity was always missions oriented and she was serving people throughout her life, I think she's been a Christian through and through. Now, here's the really interesting wrinkle. There was a period of time in the 1970s where she was a practicing Sunni Muslim. She visited an imam in prison. She got to know him through her, solidarity work with various Black national groups. And but the really interesting thing is, so she did the prayers, she covered her hair, she took instruction from this imam, but she also kept it hidden from her family members, right? So so the historians will say it's about a 4 or 5 year period, and there's not clean records about how and when she transitioned out of it. We just know it was about a 4 or 5 year period. So one might say, well, can you be both Christian and Muslim at the same time? I mean, that's a question for people who are interested in multiple religious belonging, right?
Yeah.
But post that period in the 70s, it's in the 1980s, right, where she's going back to, well, the institutional church, right? Presbyterian and then Methodist,
Mm-hmm.
right? To work in various capacities. So no doubt she has a complicated history,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I argue, yes, she's a Christian through and through, and it's her Christianity that teaches her, right, to be of service to anyone in need.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so then the sort of the other thing that you are making a point of saying in your chapter that you say maybe hasn't been identified in the other biographical narratives about her is that this issue that she was most passionate about was unjust imprisonment, which makes all the sense in the world given her experiences in young adulthood. Can you share an example or two or a story or two of the work that she did around the issue of unjust imprisonment?
Yeah, sure. So I in my chapter I discuss three, right? But the most famous one is probably Mumia Abu Jamal. He is someone that the press has labeled, the most famous person, who used to be on death row. And what's interesting about Yuri is that her support for him predated his celebrity status, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she was responsible for she and another person were helpful in getting Asian Americans to rally behind his cause. And even in her old age, people talk about her always wearing her Save Mumia t-shirt and her walker, with like 10 stickers, Save Mumia. She would write underneath she would sign her Christmas cards, love Yuri, P.S. Save Mumia. And what's really neat about the story is that she had a personal relationship with him. She came to see him as a complex human being, as a father, as a thought leader, as someone who enjoyed the work of a playwright that she also enjoyed, as someone who learned how to I think read. I'm not sure about speak a certain style or script of Japanese. So it's really, really fascinating. And when she passes, he gives a very, very loving tribute to her in his prison radio broadcast. He talks about an ancestor has passed. So he very much claimed her as one of the tribe as well.
Yeah, that's great. So as I read through all of these chapters and have these conversations with the writers of the chapters, I often find myself asking some version of the question, what does this story or this trait of this person have to do with being a witness? This sort of overarching question in the book of can I get a witness and kind of what that means. So I'm thinking about Yuri and about this sort of, she has these experiences of trauma early in her adult life and how, as we were talking about, over time, they become a part of her work and her witness. It's sort of, trauma gets transformed into vocation in some kind of way.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering what you think about that connection and what kind of, I don't know, what is the connection between trauma and then kind of ministry or vocation have to do with being a witness? How do you think about that, having spent so much time with Yuri's story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think no one would have begrudged her or any other Japanese American, so she sees the untimely death of her father, right? And she herself is incarcerated, and no one would begrudge the community, I think, if they emerged from the camps and then just simply wanted to recover their previous life to the best they could and tend to family and children. So Yuri had 6, right? So one can imagine you could just, try to put that behind you. But that's not the path she took. And I think I don't know enough about trauma to know why it just breaks some people and undoes them.
Yeah.
Or for others, it is as you said, it's the seed or the kernel that blossoms into this an incredible ministry or sense of vocation. So I think I don't know enough about why that is. I do know that there's been some speculation that she was one of a kind. So even before the camp, she was running a 3-ring circus. She was the first girl elected to student council in her high school. Again, this is an earlier time in U.S. history, right? Where minorities weren't always elected, right?
Right.
And so people talk about that she may have just been one of these manic people who just had so much energy.
Yeah.
She needed to channel it, right, in various ways. So fortunately, if she had mania or if she had, trauma-induced a vocational path to follow, it absolutely became her witness, right? Because so many people have been touched by the fruit of her witness, and so there are in some cases tangible results, as in there are people who she advocated for and they were released from prison, or she was part of the Regis movement that eventually won Japanese Americans reparations and an official apology, right? In some cases, there are tangible results. In other cases, the tangible results are maybe not the stuff that always makes it in the history books. It's the letters that she would stay up writing to people, right, to comfort them in prison. And she would send $5, $10, $20 to them just so they could buy something at the commissary, right, just to ease some of their suffering, right? Or she would visit people, right, who might be serving lifelong sentences. So this is an incredible witness, and it's been, having sat with her story for a while, it's definitely one of those, wow, Grace, what have you done lately? Given the incredible amount of work she's done, for what she's called the movement over her entire lifetime.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about her own family life. You write sort of as, this brief, almost an aside, that they would house people in their home for weeks or months at a time. Her 6 kids had to double up or sleep on the floor. Sometimes they put a mattress in the bathtub, and that their house was referred to as Grand Central Station, right? These people are coming and going all the time. I'm curious about what that, just sort of what it's like to live with that. Do you know if her children have talked about that experience or what that was like?
Yes, that's right. So her biographer, and she herself acknowledges that the costs were especially acute for the 3 younger ones. So the older ones ended up being activists of their own. But the younger ones, just, the timing of her activism, so it's 1 year in solidarity to church bombings, she said, we're not doing Christmas this year. The money I would normally have spent on Christmas presents for the kids, we're going to donate, to these causes. And so it's those mini sacrifices like that where later on she realizes it did take a toll. And the 3 younger kids, when they come of age, there's a feeling that they kind of left New York and wanted to go far away, right? Because they wanted a little bit more privacy and autonomy. There's a case where one of her sons tells her that he got in a physical altercation with an African American boy, and he feels like Yuri took the side of the African Americans because, all sorts of political reasons, as opposed to her own son. Her biographer also talks about there was, in some cases, a strain on her marriage with Bill. Because, as you said, if her house is Grand Central Station, the kids would come home and they never knew, like, do I have my own bed to sleep in tonight?
Right.
Do I have to double up? Am I going to be sent to my neighbor's house because some random kid or some college student or artist or movement activist needs a place to stay, right? But absolutely there were costs. And that itself is something I've been thinking about, especially a couple of years ago when I first started. The thought is this: there are times where I wonder, to the extent that I am worried about those personal costs, am I holding her to a higher standard because she was a mother versus a father, right? We assume that male activists, of course, their activism comes at a cost to their family life.
Sure.
So I've wrestled with that, right? To what extent is the emphasis on the personal cost gendered?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and I think this theme shows up in other places in the book, but particularly in the chapter on Howard Kester. And so it's interesting because there it is a father, but there's, in his case, it's really long absences from home. And there, his wife and his child really kind of suffer in his absence. And he has to sort of, he's pulled between these needs and he wrestles with that too. So it's really interesting. I think, yeah, the conversation between the two is really interesting. And whether it's, I'm sure there are still gendered elements of it. I mean, he was gone. He wasn't even there. That's fascinating.
Whereas Yuri would just take her kids with her to rallies. She would take them to weekly movement meetings. They would just, there was no babysitter. She would just take them, right? So they were just a part of it, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, and I think the split, too, is interesting, that the older kids grew up and kind of did similar work and that the younger kids felt that more. Just very practically, developmentally and all that makes sense. But it's kind of sort of a helpful example of how different ways that children can receive that kind of an influence and example,
Sure.
Yeah. No, that's really neat.
Yeah.
So you've sort of... in telling these different stories about Yuri, you're touching on her personality all the time. But could you talk a little bit about just sort of her personality, or what kind of a character was she to be around? What did people experience when they were interacting with her?
So, what comes out, although they don't use the term, but they talk about her being a code switcher. So she knew what to say when to different groups of people. So that comes out very strongly. So for instance, so privately, she believed that reparations for African Americans were a more urgent and pressing matter than reparations for Japanese Americans. And yet she didn't share those views with Japanese Americans, right? Lest people weaponize her words and use it against the movement, right? So that's would be one example of her kind of code switching, knowing when to say what, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Secondly, everyone talks about her as being the internet in those days, meaning somehow she could have people's addresses and phone numbers memorized. And so if people, were locked up and they had one call to make, they would call Yuri. And Yuri would then mobilize, right, the team, so to speak, right, to arrange care and, legal defense or whatever. That she just knew everyone's story. She's the one who wrote the newsletters and movement periodicals and even Christmas cards, right? Chronicling everyone's story. So she just had her hand, again, not just with Japanese Americans with redress, but African Americans and Puerto Ricans. So it was just, in that sense, she was really remarkable.
Yeah, that's great. So how do you think that Yuri Kochiyama is a witness that we need now?
Well, I think the need to show cross-racial solidarity remains. That, I think it's almost a truism to say we've become more polarized and divided, right, in recent years. And so that, for me, is a tremendous witness. I think for Asian Americans, especially, there is a temptation to revel in white adjacency. And there is a sense in which Yuri Kochiyama purposely chose downward social mobility, right? So she was raised in this custom-built house pre-war, right? Her dad was this small business owner. So they were comfortable. And she was this, very popular, celebrated person. But she purposely chose to align herself with the marginalized, right, in this country and in others. And I think that is an incredible witness, especially for Asian Americans, but really for all Christians. In this country, Christians, as you know, still have the dominant political power.
Right.
And to choose to forsake that, right, is really something.
Yeah, that's great. It's really powerful. How do you think you have been changed by spending so much time with Yuri over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so I have thought through what I can and can't do, or more correctly, what I will and won't do, right? So I don't have a marriage where I can just house 20 people, but I've been encouraged to, because I think prior to working on her, I thought of my career as kind of separate from my children. Like when I'm with my kids, I feed them, I talk with them, I drive them to their various activities.
Yeah.
And when I'm doing my work, I'm writing, I'm teaching, you know what I mean? Like it's a separate thing.
Sure, yeah.
But with her children are seamlessly interwoven in her movement activities. And as we've discussed, that has come with some costs, right? But in sitting with her, I've thought more and more about how I can integrate both sides of my life better. It'll probably not look like the Yuri Kochiyama model, right?
Right.
But, since the election of Trump, I've taken my kids to some protests. And prior to that, I probably would not have, right? So it's not just the sitting with Yuri, but it's also the recent turn of events politically.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I know that you've also, this has had an impact in your academic work. Is that right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks. So the case of reparations for Japanese Americans is probably one of the best known cases of reparations in the United States, and probably the only known case of reparations for Asian Americans. But I've been wanting to work on assembling a series of case studies of reparations involving Asian Americans, not just Japanese Americans. So there's a Chinese American case where the Senate and the House apologized for exclusion era policies. There's Filipino-American World War II veterans equity movement, given broken promises, during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So some 250,000 Filipinos fought under the U.S. flag in the Pacific Theater, and were promised certain benefits and then were denied them.
Oh, wow.
There's the Japanese-American case, and then there's this, also this case in 1993 where the United Church of Christ formally apologized to Native Hawaiians for their complicity, right, in the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 19th century.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is that the Asian American churches in the Hawaii conference of the UCC initiated their own apology and reparations to Native Hawaiians.
Wow.
So here's my assembling 3 cases where Asian Americans were the victims of a historical injustice, and the Hawaii case is one where Asian Americans were not the victims, but they were the perpetrators, right? They were complicit, right, in the suffering of another people.
Mm-hmm.
The work on reparations in this chapter has led me to try to expand all sorts of reparations cases. So I'm in the process of trying to construct an Asian American theology of reparations. Because basically I'm trying to say Asian Americans have something to say on the matter that can be context sensitive for our purposes, but also in the service of common good.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, it's been really, really fun to talk to you, Grace. Thank you for making the time to do this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can I Get a Witness? The podcast is a production of the Project on Lived Theology at the University of Virginia, a research initiative whose mission is to study the social consequences of theological ideas for the sake of a more just and compassionate world. To learn more about lived theology, visit livedtheology.org or find us on social media. This podcast is produced, edited, and engineered by Jessica Seibert, and written, edited, and hosted by me, Shay Tuttle. Original music is by Drew Wilson. Special thanks to Project Director Charles Marsh. The book, Can I Get a Witness? 13 Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators for Faith and Justice is edited by Charles Marsh, Shay Tuttle, and Daniel P. Rhodes. It's published by Eerdmans Publishing Company and is available now. Thank you for listening to Can I Get a Witness? The podcast.